Hello, and welcome everyone to today's Hasselblad webinar. I'm Mark Whitney, Hasselblad's Photographer Relations Manager, and today we've got an interview with Charlie Waite, a UK landscape photographer. So just before we meet Charlie, let's just go through some of the usual slides as an introduction. So just to let everyone know that today's webinar is going to be recorded, and a full recording will be made available to all registered users of the webinar at the Hasselblad YouTube channel, which is on the screen there. We've also got recordings of previous webinars if you may have missed them over the past few years. So if you like today's webinar and haven't seen some of the rest, you can find them on there. And then a quick agenda for today's webinar. Again, very simple today. We're going to have an introduction to Charlie and then just a general chat with Charlie, look through some of his images, some of the stories behind them, and some tips and tricks, no doubt, from his career. So today's webinar, we estimate to be around about 50 minutes in length. That should leave us about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Feel free to ask questions using the control panel to the side of your screen. We'll try and squeeze in questions also throughout the main webinar if it's relevant to what we're talking to. But if not, then hopefully we've got that 10 minutes at the end to squeeze in any general questions or to go back. So let's meet Charlie. Are you there, Charlie?
I am indeed, I am. And hello to everybody. I don't know whether it'll be a hello or good morning or a good afternoon or good evening indeed, but hello will suffice.
Yeah, I can't see your webcam, Charlie. If you just activate the webcam in the software, that we should be able to then see you.
I will. Hold on. Over to my camera. There.
There we go. There we go. Yep. Yeah. So thanks for joining us, Charlie. You're joining us today from your country retreat.
Well, my own, yes, as if I had any more. But yes, down in Dorset, in North Dorset, just jammed between Somerset and Wiltshire, on a river that I've known to love many years, called the River Stour, which rises Stour Head, surprise, surprise, and comes out in somewhere around Christchurch, southern England.
Yeah. So you have beautiful landscapes all around you, then, I guess.
Well, one or two. Each county always has its own little special things to offer, and one gets to know them and their characters and their behaviour. And sometimes they let you down, and sometimes they raise your spirits. So yes, there are a good few, I must say. Yes, I'm not short of lovely landscapes down here.
Okay, good. So quick introduction to you. We probably don't need any introduction, but just in case anyone isn't familiar with you. So you're regarded as one of the world's leading landscape photographers, and you're a Hasselblad Master as well, back in 2002, according to my records. Is that correct?
I think it could be. Yes, I think it could be. It was very, very complimentary, actually, to be described as that. But yes, I've been photographing for a fair old long time, actually. Yeah, and probably used Hasselblads from, I think, probably the late 70s, early 80s. I think, mind you, I was only 3 or 4 years old when I was doing that.
Yeah. Okay, so some of your sorry, there's a little bit of a lag here, so just please bear with us if you're watching. So yeah, basically, I've got here that you started off in the theatre, so not as a landscape photographer, but you learned how to see light in the theatre. Is that correct?
Yes, it absolutely is correct. You're quite right, Mark. It began by, I think I was about 10, maybe 10 or 12 years in the theatre, and then I went on to photograph actors, which I enjoyed very much indeed. And but the theatre, the main reason I think I enjoyed the theatre so much was not necessarily the things that happened on stage for me, but the way that the lighting director played a very, very pivotal role in bringing a play to life in a way that the actors do, and the costumes and the the director and the actors, of course, and the set designer all contribute to bringing the play to life and to making it into the special thing that it becomes. But interestingly enough, the lighting director is always what I call the unsung hero. I wouldn't mind betting not many people would be able to name a lighting director, but their role is terribly important because they can encourage the eye of the viewer to go to a particular place, and a very particular place on the stage. And then they can encourage the eye of that viewer to move across to somewhere else just by skillful lighting creativity, for want of a better word. So I used to watch that a lot, and I was always very impressed. So yes, lighting plays a big role, of course, as we all know.
Yes. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the way you work. But we say here that you've got lots of photographs in private and corporate collections around the world. So do you mainly go out and shoot for fun and then sell the images on, or work to commissions? How does it generally work for you?
Well, on the whole, I suppose the images have probably been collected over a good few years, and some of them were not appropriate for the books that I was doing. It was often books I was doing, and
Yeah.
there are many photographer friends who produce many more books than me, and I think when you've been around for a long time, maybe people just get to know you, and for me it worked just like that. I found myself being attracted by certain things. Sometimes they appeared in a book and sometimes not, and on the whole they were transparency, and sort of here I am, really. So I don't have thousands or hundreds of thousands, definitely not, but I suppose I have a fair number.
Hmm. Okay. And then I know that you like to give a lot back to the photographic industry. So we've got here that you're the founder of Light and Land, which is basically a series of photographic tours and workshops hosted by yourself and some of your colleagues in the photographic industry. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, in about 90, I don't know, 1994, I was approached by a wonderful flower photographer who said, Charlie, do you do courses? And I said, no, I don't, but I've always wanted to. So you fast forward the tape a little bit, and there we are, Sue Bishop and I, very distinguished flower photographer, as I say, and she and I put together a workshop in the Lake District. And there were no other groups anywhere in those days. I think there was perhaps just one, and the enormous amount of pleasure and response from people from all over the place. Suddenly, when they found out about it, they joined us, and we had three. We were going to have one weekend course, and we had three, one on top of the other eventually. And we learned that, of course, people absolutely love photography, but for one very special reason that I might as well say while it's in my mind, is that the camera is the most incredible conduit, not necessarily to produce the finished image, but through which we engage so profoundly with the landscape, in this case, that we're looking at. So the camera has a much bigger role in my view, but we might touch on that later. So Light and Land grew, and now we're coming up to celebrate our 30th year, I think, and we have been very honored to have some absolutely wonderfully distinguished but hugely talented photographers, landscape photographers, who are especially good at sharing and enjoy the reward from revealing things to the client, to the other photographers. So Light and Land's alive and well, and we're busy doing lots of tours and courses, and it's a great amount of fun, I have to say, and we like to travel to many different parts of the world if we can.
Okay, so we've got a slide about that a little bit later if anyone wants to find out more information. We've also got here that you also instigated the UK Landscape Photographer of the Year competition.
Well, that's very generous of you to mention it. Yes, we're into our 15th year now, and it was an idea that I had that seemed to make a lot of sense. And of course, we all know the Natural History Wildlife Photographer of the Year and the Natural History Museum. And I thought, but wouldn't it be lovely to have an exhibition, a competition that celebrated, through photography, obviously, the beauty and the wonderfully diverse nature of the United Kingdom. And then wouldn't it be great to be able to share those wonderful images? And that's exactly what we did. We started, and we got it going, and we were supported by the AA, who produced the book. And it really has been the most wonderful journey. And the prizes are, in my view, quite generous and rightly so. I'd like to think that the Landscape Photographer of the Year has been instrumental in kicking off people's careers, and that gives me enormous pleasure. Because that prize can certainly cover a website and much more. So and there's an accompanying book, and it's turned out to be really, really popular. And it's based really in one sentence. I could just say that who doesn't love landscape, and who doesn't love landscape of the United Kingdom? I mean, we really are fortunate to be here, and we're all now, my word, we are to finish gravitating so much more to nature and to the natural world. It's almost as if we were running side by side, but now we're running together, and we're not just one road next to another one. We're really so involved with the natural world, more than ever, I think. So it's a terrifically exciting time to be looking through a camera.
Yeah, and with the competition, you've also, there's not just the UK, you've done other areas of the world as well, haven't you? Is that right?
We did America, and that's hopefully going to be revived again. But my main focus really is on the British one, okay. We have very grateful to have Network Rail allowing us to exhibit in nine or 10 stations, which is just great. So, you know, thank you to Network Rail, I think I should say, allowing lots of people to see lovely landscapes of the UK. Not much wrong with that.
Yeah. Okay, and we've got Charlie's website and Instagram handle there if anyone wants to see more of Charlie's work and follow him, so you can go and check him out after the webinar. As with most of our webinars, we like to talk about cameras first and get sort of some of the camera sort of technical stuff out the way. So as we said in the description for this webinar, you're affectionately known as Mr. Square by some people in the industry for your trademark square format images, and it mostly comes from this camera here, the Hasselblad V System. So what part has this camera played in your career?
It's played a huge part, partly because every single time I've got the Hasselblad V System in my hands, I feel just that I've just picked up my friend, and that means an enormous amount to me. And I will have to admit to you, it's very emotional. It's very nostalgic, and I was rather amused just the other day when I pressed the shutter next to somebody, and they didn't see that I had a camera on in my hand, and he said that sounds like a Hasselblad, and it is a most incredibly distinctive shutter release button, which we know. But square, I do know that human vision, of course, is more oval, really, and then the parameters of human vision are not, you know, super wide. Obviously, if you have a super wide lens on, then you see with that lens probably more than you might with your own vision, where you can focus and concentrate. So the square is slightly disagrees, if you like, with human vision, but I grew so fond of it. I really did. It made you be very disciplined in terms of your composition and the elements that you were going to incorporate into that square. And after all, those bits, I call them a production. Actually, I don't really say photograph anymore. I think it's a multi-dimensional production with so much going on, and it's very easy to see globally. But the viewer, a bit like I always think interior design, they come into a room and they say, "Oh, isn't this lovely?" But they may not necessarily see all the bits, but you should have done. And a landscape photographer is a noticer. So I noticed a lot with square and love it very much indeed, and still to this day.
Okay, so how many V System cameras have you owned during your career?
Well, surprisingly, I think I have to be honest. I don't think probably more than 3. Because they you know, they just go on and on. They really do. And I always like to think that I think I'm right in saying, and you might have to help me here, Mark, that the very first V System came out around 1957, and that's really exciting, really, to think that I'm holding a camera that first began life in 1957. So there is another thing to add to that, which we might talk about in a little while when we talk about get onto the digital area.
Yeah, well, let's move on to that then. So you now also use the 907X. So the beauty of this camera is it's almost 2 cameras in one. So You can use it as a standalone camera with what we call the 907X body, which uses our X system lenses. So how familiar is that to what you're used to with the V system cameras?
Well, what is quite marvelous is that the Hasselblad back maintains my sentimental aspect of my photography and the nostalgic aspect, because that digital back will sit so sweetly, just like the film back did on the back of my V system. And it's just extraordinary that I think you might have to help me, but I'm pretty sure that that digital back will have started life maybe in the 2019, 2020, and it's going onto the back of a camera that was made in 1957. And I think that
Yep.
is the most absolutely wonderful thing for people who perhaps have not fully realized that you can put a back made up a couple of days ago, almost, let's say, okay, 2 to 3 years, onto a system that you might have had, you know, some 60 odd years previously. So I do find that as a really inspired thing to have done. Yes, there she blows. And so we haven't lost sight in any way of the character of this marvelous camera, and I must say I'm wedded to it as I have been for many years.
Okay, and another question we always get on these webinars is what lenses do you have? You know, what are your go-to lenses for your work?
That's a very, very good question. The reason it's a good question is because I think I tend to not use long lenses very much, and I suspect that I would use a lens that pretty well is, I hate the word commensurate, but in keeping with my own human vision. So I don't tend to look long and far away. And maybe a small percentage of my photography is as a consequence of a long lens. But I think I've always enjoyed the 50, the 80, the standard lens, and probably the 150. And that's pretty much me, I think. I do have a 250, but which I've enjoyed from time to time. But I think somewhere between the 50, the 80, and the 150. And now that I'm using this CFV 250C back and the accompanying lens that we looked at a moment ago, that's hugely enjoyable. And of course, I did have an SWC for a while, 38, which was a marvelous thing to have. So I'm well looked after with the range of lenses, but on the whole, I think it would be 50, 80, and 150.
Okay, so let's have a look at some of your images. It always fascinates me, some of the stories you have behind some of your images, and you know, behind the scenes, and how you come to be presented with this scene, and how you then you know, portrayed it in the camera. So yeah, tell us a little bit about this one.
Well, yes, see if I can be quite quick. There's an overall area of photography that I find completely fascinating, and I think the more we think about it, the more involved we get, which is this idea of a photograph being more of a production, as I said, multidimensional production. And when you're on the lookout, you detect a potential image to be made and subsequently owned, if you like, by you and your camera, from all sorts of different areas. That you can just arrive at something and you make an assessment and you make an evaluation and you detect and then you see which bits you'll have and which bits you won't. Now, who could have thought that with this photograph I would arrive at a beach which in itself had quite good structure. I mean, I had a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 horizontal lines, all pretty much matching in terms of axis, matching one another. And I thought that looks great. I think I'm happy with that. I wouldn't mind something to animate this image if possible. And I looked to my right, and this is absolutely true, and a cow was coming along, paddling. And behind it were probably another 10, 12, maybe 15 cows. And we've got some cows here with 6 legs. But generally speaking, they all arrived. They stopped in front of my camera and began to just sort of communicate with each other, talk to each other, have a little paddle. And I thought, here it is. All of a sudden, this scene has come to life, and it was completely remarkable, and I would say absolutely outrageous. I mean, I have never been accompanied by cows, who I actually think are very underrated animals, and I won't go there, but I do think they are completely marvelous. And all of a sudden, I found myself having to learn very quickly how to speak, how to moo, basically, because one cow, that's the second one in from the left, black one looking at me, decided to come and see who the heck I was. So with my best moo language, I managed to encourage her to go back a little bit. And honestly, she looked at me as if to say, okay, I thought we were going to make friends, but all right. So she went back to that position, but in alignment again with the others. Just completely bizarre. So that gave me a 1, 2, 3, 4. In a way, it gave me another emphasis on the horizontal axis. So that memory of those beloved sacred cows, as they have become in my heart, is very, very powerful indeed. So thank you very much for choosing this one.
Okay. How much do you plan your images? I mean, like, you know, photography, landscape is a lot around about the light, and obviously light changes depending on the time of the day. So do you go and ever scout locations and then come back at the right time, or is it a case of your experience already tells you what the time should be, so you can do it in the one visit? How does that work?
I think I'd love to be able to say that I'm that organized. Oh, we've gone to another one. That's fine.
Yeah.
I think no, it's all right. I think I'm not. I'd like to think I'm fairly organized. But one of the things that I think remains so wonderful about landscape photography is the element of surprise, and is the element of what I call photographic ecstasy, which can suddenly be round the corner. And it's as if you're offered something and you're given something, and in a way you're honoring it. And the photographic process is essentially you're kind of bowing down with gratitude, because it's just such an elusive process. And we all know, and many of my very, very distinguished landscape photographer friends, both professional and amateur, of which there are so many, we're pretty good, us British photographers, but don't want to separate myself from other viewers from elsewhere. Landscape photographers absolutely love what they do. I think they probably have their own private discipline. I think my thing that I care mostly about is the fact that I haven't missed anything. That I'm seeing everything that I can possibly see, and I think skies play a huge role. I've got a little pet phrase, rather a lot of them, that often skies that are not in your photograph are as important as the ones that are. Now, both are important, but they play a hugely important role in building, and it is a building process, building your photograph. And photography deserves the credit it should get. It isn't just a photograph. It's not just point your camera and do a nice record. It's a very, very profound piece of work that can affect people very, very deeply. It can bring people to tears. And we must remember that the still photograph has no music, it has no dialogue, it doesn't move. So it has an immense role to play to activate your emotional responders inside you. And it's not just, you know, a pretty pattern. It's something that stimulates your emotion very, very profoundly. So the important thing is, I think, to make sure that you haven't neglected anything. The worst thing in the world, very quickly to say, it's you cannot afford to say, oh, I never saw that, about your own photograph. That's smack wrists. But moving on to this one is Rydal Water in the Lake District, for which I needed my ladder. And now wanting to get up higher isn't necessarily always the case. Sometimes you want to get lower. And another little phrase, reveal more than conceal, but sometimes conceal more than reveal. And so this one was definitely a question of revealing. When I got here, I couldn't see the back line of reeds, the paler amber, almost yellow line of reeds. And then I realized I needed another foot. Well, I'm only 6'2" pretty much, and I needed to be 7'2", which I'm not. So I rushed back to the car, got my little ladder and stood on it, and it just offered me the reeds in the background. So in other words, it opened up a sense of depth. that's one of the things that we need to mitigate if we can, is that photography does turn a three-dimensional image into a two-dimensional image. So to mitigate that, we need, in my view, to try and reintroduce a sense of depth. And that is done by presenting different layers within one's photograph. And I think an enormous number of my distinguished friends will do that instinctively. But it's a very important thing to watch, I think. So I'm not saying we always need to be high, but sometimes it really does help a great deal.
Okay, and you mentioned about emotions a minute ago, and how people feel when they look at photographs. And I think didn't you do a project, was it during the pandemic, where you were providing imagery for doctors' waiting rooms in the National Health Service in the UK, is that right? And because there was research to show that helped to make people feel better?
I think it does, yes. But actually, I could go further. I think nature stimulates people regardless of whether they're sick or well. I mean, I do think that something has happened. I mentioned it just recently, that there are those who've absolutely wondered at the natural world. But it is as if just recently people have become sort of more switched on to it. I mean, quite a good line is, another favorite one is that Ansel Adams, the great, enormous intellect in the head of a great landscape photographer, actually. People often forget that his intellect was just immense, and he was able to discuss photography in a way that not many people since have really been able to. I couldn't come near him in the way that he produced so a wonderful analysis of what landscape photography does. But it was said of him by the head of MoMA, I think, that he was able to convert geographic reality to transcendent emotional experience. And I almost have to do that when I hear that. He was able to convert geographic reality to transcendent emotional experience. And I think that's what happens. And I think when we see beauty, which on the whole landscape is, I mean, look how we honor trees, these stately, noble things that we call trees. We now learn that they're communicating with each other. Well, yes, thank you for having that confirmed, So the natural world is beautifully bound together, and there's a wonderful harmonizing relationship that every living thing has. And we're the ones, if I may just quickly say, who are ever so slightly out of step with the natural world, but we're getting there, and we really are. And so I think beauty plays a huge role, and the natural world plays an important role in when people are not well, sadly, and the people who are fortunately are well.
Okay, let's move on to the next image. Yeah, so what's the story behind this one?
Well, it's important, I think, Mark, for me to say that I was very fortunate to be asked to do a book on Venice that was going to be, well, I really was incredibly pleased, but at the same time I was very, very frightened. I was honored that Jan Morris was going to write, and did write, the foreword. I found Venice absolutely wonderful. I really did, and I don't think I wouldn't be alone on that. It's almost a fantasy city, and many people know it, and many people have yet to know it. But I found it quite. I'm pleased that it was the case. I found it quite difficult, but it was a very joyous kind of difficulty, because it was about selection. I mean, really was extraordinary to bear in mind that there are 410 bridges in Venice, in the region of, and it's you can't unfortunately just say, oh, it's Venice, everything is lovely. And many people say, oh, you can't go wrong in Venice. Oh, yes, you can. And I went wrong frequently. But and then because it was so complex, a series of shapes, and once or twice I got fortunate, and I found this one which I like very much, where there was an interlocking of two arches, two arcs, and I've always rather been fond of the way geometry plays an important role in the photographic seeing process and construction process to a greater or lesser extent. And these two arcs just sweetly were just interlocking so nicely. And I was really, really pleased with it. Then all of a sudden a motorboat came along and it was over. But luckily I had managed to secure my photograph before the little motorboat came along. But I urge people to go to. It's just terrific. But it's not exactly offered on a plate, but that makes photography so enjoyable.
So is travel one of your sort of interests as well? Obviously, you get to travel to some amazing places to take landscape. So is that a part of the work that you enjoy?
Yes, it is. It most certainly is. But it's not. I think the first thing I should quickly say is that um, if you sort of unravel the United Kingdom into its different sort of areas, we are rich. I mean, we really are rich, and we've got some marvelous photographers who are producing some absolutely gorgeous, breathtakingly wonderful images that transport us to transcendent emotional experience. But I think Britain is so fortunate to have, let's face it, images that could be mistaken for, almost Utah, or anywhere else in the world. So we've got amazing variety. So we don't really always have to leave home. Having said that, travel is stimulating, not just for photography, for meeting other nationalities, and I think that's terribly important. So travel is rich, but that doesn't mean to say we're leaving Britain behind. Britain should never be forgotten. And here we are. We've travelled to Corfu, and
Yes.
that's really an extraordinary combination. I nearly thought, Mark, I can't do this because it won't be believed after a storm. And suddenly the light came and delivered this extraordinary, vivid turquoise cyan color. And I was just astonished by it. There had been terrifically heavy rain, and we mustn't forget that rain plays the most wonderful part, especially in April, the April showers, where we can get an absolutely vicious, almost, rainstorm, thunderstorm, and 15 minutes later, the storm has passed on and gone off into the distance. But meanwhile, the atmosphere has not got a single molecule of dust in it for about 5 to 10 minutes, I've reckoned, and then you'll see a little bit of a hint of haze build up in the far background. But just those first 5 to 10 minutes are thrilling because the light is absolutely so razor sharp and so exciting. I don't like to use the word dramatic, but just exciting because it's a time to see the landscape that you simply would never see under normal circumstances. If you're near a motorway, you can be 5 miles from the motorway, and there will be the consequences of thousands, hundreds of thousands of motor cars in the sky above you where you're photographing 5 miles away. But not Corfu, not on this day. This day, there had been this terrific storm, and then suddenly it presented itself, and it was almost as if the sea said, "That's how I'm supposed to look, buddy." And oh my word, it really did. I think it was on Fuji Velvia, which had a reputation, still does, for being sort of slightly over glamorous. But if anything, it needed to be calmed down a bit. But that I remember distinctly. That was how it was.
Hmm. Okay, so this is a good example of your square format, and we've got a few questions coming in about your use of square format now with the digital sensors, because obviously they aren't square. So when you're shooting with digital cameras, do you still do a square crop, or do you adapt to the digital sensor at all?
I do to a degree, because it offers me both in a way, the digital sensor, because I'm seeing rectangular where I never really did. So now that I've got rectangular, I can see square. But when I had square, I wasn't so good at seeing rectangular because I was so wedded to square, and still am. So it was more in favor of one direction than the other. But I think what's rather important is probably the cropping mechanism is often neglected. And with light and lamp, we do a lot of talking about cropping, because that decision, where am I going to cut this image? What am I going to omit? I've got a little phrase, another one, if you can bear it, omit the redundant. And then establishing what are the redundant bits, what are the bits you don't want, and what are the bits you do. And so I find that rectangular has almost, in a way, reintroduced me to, if you like, a format of photography that maybe I had neglected a little bit. I wasn't totally wedded to square, but I would think it was fair to say that a good 60, 70, 80% maybe my work was square. So I think the cropping, the ability to know where to crop, I think is very good. I think it's broadened my photography. There's no question about that. It really has, yeah, really has. But I still love my square.
Okay, so another square image here, and this is one of my favorites for what you're about to point out, I think. Yeah, so tell us a bit about this.
Well, I grew up near Salisbury Cathedral in southern England, and I think we all know that the nave of a cathedral almost brings you to a complete standstill when you look up and you see the construction. And Salisbury, there's not a lot you can say except just stand gasping. And the nave of a cathedral is incredibly comforting. Its role is, there are many different roles it plays, but it's hugely comforting. It's not in any way threatening. And of course, you're encouraged to walk along toward the altar. And that's used in many different ways. It's used in cloisters in many Mediterranean countries. When I saw this in the Lot Valley in France, the thing that I cared a lot about was the line of trees, obviously, and getting them sort of vaguely symmetrical. And also, I didn't want them to block each other, so I was really quite concerned about them. But I got the light arrived very nicely. And I have another phrase which I can't help you, I've got to tell you, which is I've done the reveal more than conceal, but this is it'll come back to me in a minute, but it's one that I quite like. Yeah, attend to everything and let everything attended to be either intended or accepted to be there. Attend to everything, let everything attended to be either intended or accepted to be there. So that's Charlie's little kind of pet phrase, yet another one, as I'm sure some people find rather dull. However, that means be super aware of absolutely everything that is going on within the frame, like a painter would, like a musician would, like a carpenter would. So should a landscape photographer. Every single thing in there, you should ideally be able to be aware of and understand. So I showed this to somebody a year or so ago, maybe longer, and up it went on the screen. And suddenly from the back of the auditorium came a bellowing sentence, "Damn fine bottle of Chardonnay there, right in the middle of your photograph." And of course I said, "What? Oh my gosh." And then Charlie had to admit, attend to everything? Nope, he didn't, because I didn't see that bottle. I just saw the light and how the trees work quite well. And I can only assume that this brigadier, he must have been, had a particular partiality to Chardonnay, white wine. But so it's very easy sometimes to miss something so huge. But now I'm that was a little while ago, but it just shows you that one can't always practice what one preaches. But it gives me a lot of pleasure. So quite a good little tale and a true one.
Okay, got a question from Grant. He's asking, are you inspired by any artists outside of photography in the last year? Or in general, are you inspired by things outside of photography or other artists?
My mother used to say, "Charlie, you've got to go to more galleries. You must look at more oil paintings. You must look at some of the classical painters and look at how they've conveyed light and sky." And I didn't do it enough. I think I need very much, always I feel I've got to go and see more work, not just photography. And I really do try. And I stand in front. I like to be helped in front of the image. I like to be helped by somebody who knows more about things than I do. But my mum did say to me, go and study Claude Lorraine. And so Claude Lorraine, I look at, I've begun to know a little bit more about him. And oh my word, light is just quite phenomenal. So yes, I need to see more. I love looking at other artworks. I love looking at any other creativity, and I just stand there. I look at a table and the way they're made, and we are phenomenally creative in our own special way. I think we are. And looking at this, it's worth mentioning. It's near. I decided after reading the great Sebastian Faulks's book Bird Song. I went I went really to some of the most sorrowful and tragic places in northern France where the Great War was fought. And this was near Amiens. And I passed it and I looked at it and I thought, no, it's lovely, but it's not right. It's just not right. And I couldn't quite identify what it was. And I really struggled, and I thought, but it's got all the component parts. I love cold and warm together. That works very well. There's a lovely purity here in some way. There's not too much confusion. Each tree is pretty much identifiable, but it's something not right. Just is not working. So I left. And I came back a little bit later, probably about 4 or 5, maybe more hours later. And suddenly I looked at it and it was pretty much lit in exactly the same way. And I thought, oh my word, this is marvelous. It's right. It's really right. And I suddenly realized why. There was a little brown belt where the water had subsided at the bottom of each tree. So it separated reality from reflection. And that worked really, really well. So suddenly I had a photograph that did not seem to work beforehand. And not for any other reason except that I just couldn't figure out quite why it wasn't. As I say, it still was lovely and sunny, it still had great, nice blue sky, some white clouds, but all of a sudden it worked very well for me as a consequence of the water subsiding no more than a couple of inches.
Okay, we've got a question from Klaus. He compliments you on how your horizons are perfectly horizontal. So do you use a tripod and a spirit level to get this right?
I think you might well find that that's not 100% the case, but that's very complicated. If you haven't found a wonky horizon, but I care about it because there was a poem, I can't remember who wrote it, where it was described that the finest horizon in the world is the horizon of the sea. Sorry, the most perfect horizon, which of course it is. You can quite understand why people prior to us arriving to this generation thought that the world was flat. So I do use a tripod, and oddly enough, the reason for using the tripod is I think it's quite comforting, and it makes you feel that the production that you're engaging with is, you take it pretty seriously. I think the iPhones are marvelous. I think any kind of photography is valid. I heard there were 350 million photographs uploaded to Facebook, somebody told me the other day, every 24 hours. So that's quite something. But I think iPhone photography is, whatever phone you're using is great. The only thing is I think you might not be there for very long, and it could be that you don't need to be. But I think when you put the camera on a tripod, you're rolling up your sleeves, you're getting down to business, you know, you're taking your jacket off and you're doing that and you think, right, let's get to work. And it's a really lovely feeling. And if the very first position that you felt was going to be correct and it was on a tripod, that's quite nice, because you might then wander off and have a look at maybe 6 inches either side, or a little bit lower, a little bit higher, whatever it may be. But you're quite pleased with yourself that position number one and angle number one turned out to be the right one. And that's rather lovely when you fall upon that first decision and it turns out to be the right decision. So I think tripods, many of us can't bear them, but many of us have a love-hate relationship with them. You pinch yourself sometimes, but anyway, I think a tripod is important to have, but not necessarily crucial for some photographers.
Yeah.
Almond blossom. Shall I talk a little bit about the almond blossoms?
Yeah.
Well, if you go about a week either side of Valentine's Day, around well, whatever it is, about the 8th of February through to maybe the end of February, one of the great joys is that the almond blossom will say to you that you are now looking at me when I'm at my absolute best, and it's the first blossom to appear. And one of the great joys of it is that it is a sea of pink, or sea of pink or white. And it's quite difficult because they're quite busy. That they're all over the place, and it really is a great joy to immerse yourself into this huge area of pink in southern Spain and Andalusia. And if you want to see it, well, you could come on a nice land trip. But if you don't want to do that, then what you could do is fly into Malaga, hire a car, drive for probably no more than an hour and a half, 2 hours on your way up to Granada, hang a right, as they say, and then suddenly you'll be in the midst of pink, and more pink or white than you've ever seen before. So the almond blossom, I think, is a bit like the hops and the apple blossom in Kent, times 1,000. It's just phenomenal. So have a look at the almond blossom next February.
Okay, another question, to squeeze in another question if we could. A question from Phil. He's saying, do you find you shoot more when you're using digital than what you did when you were using film? Yeah, is that
That's a
something that...
very, very, very good question. And the reason it's a good question is because it actually confirms something that I think has taken place. It's not a crime at all. There's no sort of set rules about photography. You develop your own approach, your own style, the things and why you're driven to photograph. But one thing digital has brought, I think, and the only word I can use, I'm going to use, is a degree of recklessness. And one of the great joys, if we rewind the tape for Ansel and his contemporaries and Westerns, is that a 10.8 and a 5.4, I'm not saying it made you take your photograph more seriously just because of the economics, but I think you were aware of the photograph being, if you like, more sacred, more precious, more important. But you could say, no, Charlie, I'm not going with that. But recklessness doesn't bring necessarily a discipline, where you might ask yourself, well, why have I just done 15 of exactly the same thing? The light hasn't changed, the wind hasn't changed, the direction of the light hasn't changed. Absolutely everything is completely the same. The sky is absolutely motionless, and yet I'm doing another 10. Way back when, I remember thinking, I've got a roll of 12 or whatever it is, or I have to be aware that I don't have 1,000 rolls of film in my pocket. And I think it's fair to say, I can't remember exactly, but I believe a gigabyte or a 32 gigabyte card, somebody will no doubt in our audience will be able to calculate this very quickly, is probably equivalent to maybe hundreds of thousands of small JPEGs. And so when we first started Light and Lamp, when digital came along, we said, right, you've got what was it, a 256 megabyte card, and on you go. So that, in a way, I think was quite good. But I should just quickly say that the important thing about it is that I don't want for one moment to restrict people's experimentation. And that's where the word reckless is taken away, and replace it with experimentation. That's a healthy, creative, artistic process that's really, really important. So the two things side by side. So for experimentation, you're learning, you're new to photography, or maybe not so new. You want to be able to have the opportunity of being able to have lots of choice, and you don't want to say, oh, my card's run out. So really it depends on how you look at it. But I think there is something to be said for the discipline of those photographers in the previous years.
Yep. So this one, yeah, I love the light in this image.
Well, it's in Buttermere in the Lake District. And one of the things I'm rather pleased about was managed that I didn't forget my ladder. And that's kind of important. And the reason it's important is, although I can't demonstrate it now, I can just describe it. It mattered to me that the two descending slopes at pretty much the same angle were, and it's a tree many people know, I'm sure, and have known longer than I, that those two descending slopes are parallel to one another, and they're not interrupted by anything. When I arrived, the top of the tree was pricking the first slope. So I managed to run and go and get my ladder. And as a consequence, that was able to drop the tree, which was theatrically lit if by my friend, the lighting director up there. And that managed to drop it underneath the first descending slope, thereby delivering depth, the big D word, that depth word, which really does, I think, enhance landscape photography if it's available. and sometimes it'll be flat, and that will be the intention. So and then the other thing that I'm pleased about is the right-hand descending slope of the tree was parallel to the descending slope right hand of the back mountain. So they just fit very snugly together. And it's like interior design with photography. I'm not saying it's that always that precise, but I think if you have some relationships somewhere, I'm very keen on depth and relationships, DNR. And I think if you've got those relationships, they are picked up by the viewer, who may not be able to unravel them, may not be able to define where they have been achieved and where they're evident, but finds the overall image globally deeply satisfying. And it's only when you start taking it apart, which is, I find absolutely fascinating, the unraveling process, you realize what that landscape photographer engaged with and what they delved into, which was having all sorts of this part of the image basically interacting with each other, all these little elements all talking to each other. And I think that's really important. So yes, I too like this one very much.
Okay, then far removed from the square format, this was an X-pan image, I believe.
I think it was. I have to say I can't be sure, but the dimensions were the same. So I'm very fond of this because I really didn't have I didn't have the wherewithal, a ladder this time, to ensure that the top of the little thatched dwelling was going to sit very comfortably in line with the mountain range, which were pretty much in a line. And when I arrived, the top of this little thatched dwelling was actually pricking not just the mountain, but right up over that cloud. So it looked ridiculous. And then there was nothing else to be able to basically get into the image. It needed animating somewhere. So I ran into the local school because I needed height. And I asked them if they had something I could stand on. And the school, there are only about 80 people living on the island. And the school had about 6, maybe 10 children. And the master spoke perfect English. And he knew exactly, he looked out of the door of the school, and he said, "I know just what you need." And he said in whatever language Bolivian, to his children, his students, "Get that desk, all of you, and bring it down for this man." And so there are now, I think there are probably 6 children around the age of 10, let's say, holding on to a desk, school desk, on which I was standing, to enable me to get higher and high enough to be able to tuck the apex of the little thatched dwelling underneath the clouds and in line with the mountains. But then I thought, oh, there's nothing else. That's not enough. You can't just have a huge, panoramic without anything else. And suddenly enter stage right comes a little boat with no wind in it at all. And then I thought, come on. And then all of a sudden the wind arrived, delivered a blue triangular reflection to match the reflection made by the little thatched dwelling. So they talked to each other, and there was an established relationship. And the light on the pillars, on the little bits of wood, lit up very sweetly and picked up the white clouds. And so really there was a wonderful coherence, if you like, to the photograph. And so I really thank that master for getting his 6 little students to hold onto the desk when I stood on top of it with a tripod. It's quite funny.
Now, we've had quite a few questions about your post-processing, and along the lines of really that you probably don't need much, because it sounds like a lot of your photographs are actually captured sort of in camera and don't often have to have post-processing. Is that correct?
Well, I think that could be taken as a sort of boast. I'm a purist. I don't use the computer. The very first thing I'm going to say, and I think this is terribly important, Photoshop has awakened photography for so many people, and so has Lightroom and all of the other image manipulating software. I think if you like, it enhances your artistic interpretation, and it will deliver back to you what you intended, but perhaps what you weren't able to achieve. That's not what's wrong with that. Absolutely marvelous. The key really is to not cross the line. The very moment that somebody looks at one of your images and detects something that just troubles them in some way, either emotionally or visually or creatively, artistically, that relationship will be not, I'm going to say it could be broken. And the moment it's broken, it cannot really re-emerge. The distrust and a degree of just feeling a bit uncomfortable about a particular photograph. So don't cross the line. And I think that's where I would use the word reckless. I think a certain amount of, depends what style, but if you're producing a landscape photograph that has got a couple of things that you would just like to alter very subtly, then I think Photoshop is marvelous. And as I say, don't cross the line. But if you want to, that's up to you. It's your camera, it's your photography. But I do think it's good, and I like to try and get it right in cameras. There's a certain amount of joy in that. I like using graduated filters soon too. I like polarizers. And looking at this one, Chateau Sully in Burgundy, it gives me enormous pleasure to remember the joy I had when I had my dark sky above, and these thrilling little turrets, each one lit so nicely. And it was like a sort of fantasy, really, a magical fantasy chateau, and just really so romantic, and beautifully done. And I was with my mum there, and I remember her saying, "Did you get your photograph?" And I always like to think of what does that mean? Did you get your photograph? We know what it means. Did we produce an image that is in keeping with your, to use the great Ansel, your pre-visualization? Did that match with what you had in your head and your heart? And as Cartier-Bresson said, all head, heart, and eye all being on the same axis. And that was the case here. It really was, no question about it. So, and then a polarizer, interestingly, just slightly took that gleam off. It was a bit fiercer. So don't discount the polarizer. It's a most extraordinary, difficult sometimes filter to use. Do try and look through what you're intending making a photograph of. Look through the polarizer before it goes on the camera. A polarizer will have an effect on some things somewhere absolutely all of the time, and you cannot say, oh, it's a polarizer, it's just darkening the blue sky, I'm pronouncing the white clouds. Oh my gosh, a ton more than that. It will affect things absolutely everywhere. It'll increase contrast where there's dock leaves down in a little bush. So I urge people to use a polarizer with great care. 2 stops when it's fully polarized, 1 2/3 when it's not, but use with care. But it cannot be replicated, to a tiny degree maybe, but it can't really be, in my view, with the image manipulating software. And then the other is a graduated filter, and I don't know that I use it. I don't think so. I seem to remember the rain. I may well have done. Yeah, I think I may well have done. I do. And a fairly mild one. But I do think that landscape photography, as is shown here, is this process of honoring something that you've come across, and you just need to own it. You cannot let it go. You can't say, oh, I won't. It's an impossibility. I won't do it. So there we are. It is a form of an addiction, I must say.
Yeah. Well, sadly, we've come to the end. And it's been, yeah, we could have gone on. I feel like we could have gone on for hours with you, Charlie. You've got so much good advice and interesting stories. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us and taking the time out of your day today.
Most welcome.
Just a reminder. Sorry. So you go again, Charlie.
I've enjoyed it hugely. And if we've had questions, but I imagine there's a facility to have more at a later date. Perhaps.
Yep. Sadly, we've had quite a few questions and haven't been able to squeeze them all in, unfortunately. But hopefully another time. Yeah. So there's Charlie's website and Instagram handle there as a reminder, if you want to go and check out his work. And also we spoke about Light and Land. So some information there if you're interested in that. It's got its own website and Instagram handle. So yeah, go along and say hi there. And that's today's webinar. So just to finish off, as always, if you could fill out the webinar feedback questionnaire that pops up when you exit the GoToWebinar software, that would be much appreciated. It helps us to understand how we're doing and what you would like to see more of. So that would be, as I say, much appreciated if you can spare the time for that. And then just another reminder that the webinar has been recorded today. So within a few hours or maybe tomorrow morning, we'll hopefully have that up on our the Hasselblad YouTube page, and you can watch it all back. And then obviously for anything for Hasselblad, we've got hasselblad.com. So you can find everything on there for all our future webinars and events around the world. Obviously lots on our products, our partner network, lots of inspiration with stories and images, lots on Hasselblad's history and heritage. And you can also request a demo and request any support that you might need. So thanks to Charlie once again, and thanks to everyone for joining in and taking part. And we'll hope to see you on another webinar again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.